Hello, hello, hello. In recent days, the seemingly undying matter of reparations for slavery is back in the news cycle, with people saying that it's going to become a matter of importance in the upcoming Heads of Governments meeting for the Commonwealth in Samoa. Reparations is one of those topics that people will go on about seemingly until the cows come home, and nothing really ever gets done about it. But I thought I might as well take the opportunity to say some things about it, and if you find the video entertaining, then that's a win, I guess. Of course, it should go without saying that I am 100% against the idea of reparations. They make no sense, and to me, I think they're just a blatant effort to impoverish the West. Mind you, having said it will never happen, I think we are seeing a sort of reparations in the form of DEI hiring policies and racialised benefits, such as in South Africa or America. Anyway, throughout this video, I'll also be including clips from my discussion with Jake about the matter, so please enjoy. Let's get into it. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back, bloody bar intro. So again, I'm here with...
No, start that again. Start that again.
I'm going to do that bit separately.
I'm looking at this picture of this bloke on the Guardian fucking article. It just looks so stupid.
Right, so the matter of reparations comes up every now and then, and if I'm completely honest, at this point I think it's just noise. I don't think the British government will ever be paying the insanely high amounts that these people are asking for. I think if they were asking for, 10 billion, maybe we'd be stupid enough to pay them, but 200 billion to 18 trillion, that's never going to happen, because it would mean the wipeout of the government in the next election. And as much as we have a uni party, I don't think any government is going to commit to destroying themselves in that way. I think it's too destabilising for the neoliberals. Anyway, so I'm going to be looking at this article. It's more than a year old, but it has a lot of interesting points in it. So, UK cannot ignore calls for slavery reparations, says leading UN judge. Patrick Robertson says reparations for transatlantic slavery is required by history and is required by law, which is utter bollocks. Right, so a leading judge at the International Court of Justice has said that the UK will no longer be able to ignore the growing calls for reparations for transatlantic slavery. Judge Patrick Robinson, who presided over the trial of the former Yugoslav president Slobodan Milosevic, said that the international tide on slavery reparations was quickly shifting and urged the UK to change its current position on the issue. He said, "They cannot continue to ignore the greatest atrocity, signifying man's inhumanity to man. They cannot continue to ignore it. Reparations have been paid for other wrongs and obviously far more quickly, far more speedily than reparations for what I consider the greatest atrocity and crime in the history of mankind, transatlantic chattel slavery. I believe that the United Kingdom will not be able to resist this movement towards the payment of reparations. It is required by history and it is required by law."
Says who?
Yeah.
The claim is complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense.
Of course it is.
And by saying it's required by law, by what law?
Yeah.
I don't remember Parliament pushing through a law saying that we've got to pay Caribbean nations £200 billion for slavery reparations by the country and the empire that ended it. So it's just noise and it's complete nonsense.
This is just a madness. This is just a madness. It is completely ahistorical. I'll address the easier matter first. It is required by law. What law? What law? We are talking about a period of 1619 to 1834. What international legal bodies were there at this time? There weren't any, and there were no national legal bodies saying this either. The laws that applied in the United Kingdom were distinct and different from the laws that applied in the colonies. There was no law, and the fact that this supposed judge would claim that it is required by law, it's madness. Absolute madness.
You wouldn't go to Japan and tell a Japanese child that he's responsible for the invasion of China in the 1930s.
Exactly.
And the horrific crimes that committed there. So why are now we burdened with this? Obviously, I'm not proud of Britain doing slavery, not at all. But every country did it. Every empire did it.
Yes.
it was the norm, unfortunately, and that's history. A lot of countries and a lot of empires did bad things in history,
There's a
right?
scene in Bridge on the River Kwai where I'm pretty sure it's Alec Guinness talking to, I don't know the name of the Japanese actor, but saying that, the British have protection under the Geneva Convention. But the Japanese had never signed up to the Geneva Convention by then, so they weren't bound by it. And it's the same here. We weren't
Mm,
signed up to any international treaty on slavery in the period that
yes, of
we
course.
had slavery in the empire. So there's no legal requirement to pay reparations. It's pure fiction. People in the country in the West, on the whole, seem to have hold judges in high esteem, but many of these judges, especially this man, he's just an activist. That's all he cares about is activism. He doesn't actually care about making legal judgments in accordance to law. Like,
Mm.
really, he just wants to destroy the
It,
West. And then the idea that this is the greatest atrocity in the history of mankind, it's utter madness. I'm going to make a video about the British Crusade against slavery, in which I will talk at length about slavery that happened in the rest of the world. But for now, it suffices to say that slavery was everywhere and often far worse. I mean, you compare the transatlantic slavery to the East African slavery, and not only did the transatlantic have fewer slaves over a much shorter period of time, it was actually a lot kinder. Because the simple fact that it has existed since probably even before the Roman times is that if you treat your slaves well, they're not going to revolt. And you don't want them to revolt because they're working for you. Whereas in East Africa, in the Muslim world, it was a completely different attitude. I mean, they used to castrate their black slaves so that they wouldn't breed with the Arabs. I mean, to call the transatlantic chattel slavery the greatest atrocity is to diminish every other far worse atrocity. I mean, what? The Holocaust, the Holodomor, Mao's Great Leap Forward, the East African slave trade, the Japanese treatment of war prisoners. So much is so much worse than this. Absolute madness. And it was everywhere. I can't get past this point. Slavery was universal. Abolition was the exception. It is as though because we had this great moral revelation about slavery that we are then punished. Does that seem odd to you? The countries that held on to slavery the longest, Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, the Arab world in large extent, are punished for it far less than the Western world, which, relatively speaking, was far earlier in abolishing it. It's completely backwards. Completely backwards. But the reason for this, by the way, is that we're the only ones fool enough to listen to these claims. The reason Saudi Arabia isn't harassed about their legacy of slavery is because they pay no attention to the harassment. And nor should we pay much attention to it either.
I believe there is a statistic that said that the British taxpayer was still paying off the freedom of slaveries, like the Crusades, up until about 2015.
Yeah, 2015. We took out a
2015.
loan to
So
buy the freedom of all the slaves, and that loan was still being repaid until 2015.
exactly. So what was the point of taking out that loan then? If we've then got to by law pay £200 billion reparations, reparations for what?
Yeah.
What this is them trying it on and saying, right, we need a certain amount of money. They're trying it on because the government is so weak. They've seen this new Labour government in, this new lefty government come in, and they thought these are an easy target. And it's obvious they're an easy target because of the Chagos Islands. There are lefty think tanks within government advising government officials such as David Lammy, Ed Miliband, and most likely Keir Starmer, that saying, "Oh, but look how bad we were 400 years ago. We got to pay it off." It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's utterly ridiculous.
Anyway, so there was this study published by the University of the West Indies that concluded that the UK alone is required to pay a sum of £18.8 trillion. Like, that's so insane of an amount that I can't. It's ridiculous. Absolute insanity. This is Marxist maths for you. I mean, let's look at the GDP of this time. We're looking from 1619, which isn't on the graph, up to at latest 1834. £18.8 trillion, this number, compared to an economy of about 100 to 400 million pounds. This is like 5 orders of magnitude more than the GDP of the time. And the British GDP wasn't even that heavily affected by slavery either. It was quite a small part of the economy. So, I mean, how they get these numbers is absolutely ridiculous.
Thankfully, it's just noise.
I don't
think
it's never actually going to happen because no government's going to commit to a policy that will see them wiped out in the next election. But, I mean, the fact is that David Lammy, when he was like in opposition and not really... he was taken about as seriously as Diane Abbott. For years, he'd just been a race grifter saying, I want reparations for my people. Because his people is not Britain, it's Black Caribbeans. There's a debate about whether people with dual citizenship should even be allowed in government as elected members, or at least in cabinet. But I think a foreign secretary is one of those key roles, probably along with Home Secretary and Prime Minister, where you probably shouldn't have someone whose allegiance is not fully to the crown. And Lammy, undeniably, his allegiance is not to the British crown.
His allegiance is to activists.
It's to his own racial group.
It's the thing is, as well, I'd like to actually know what the Caribbean people think about this. Because I suspect a lot of Caribbean people would look at this and go, that is ridiculous.
Yeah.
What a stupid request. It's ridiculous.
How they get to these numbers. I mean, there was a thing from India where some Marxist Indian economists tried to calculate how much Britain stole from India. And it was like hundreds of trillions of pounds, which is more than like the British government has ever had. Especially at the time, it was probably more than the combined wealth of everyone in Britain that apparently we stole from India. And they're like calculating stuff like wages lost because they were employed by a British person instead of an Indian person. It's all madness. It's like if they saying like I should have been paid £14 an hour instead of £7 an hour, therefore you stole £7 from me per hour. That's the sort of logic that's gone on here. That I presume that's how they got to the 18 trillion. I mean, 200 billion is still also madness, but it's more plausible than fucking trillions. So when asked if the high figures came as a surprise, Robinson said no. These calculations are not over a period of 5 years or 10 years. They cover... he says no. Utter insanity. Like, of course we know it.
He said that. He said that with a straight face, presumably.
Yeah. Anyway, so he's saying we should repay it between 10 and 25 years.
Oh, at least he's being reasonable. No. Fuck off. It's utterly ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous.
The much smaller loan we took out to buy the freedom of all the slaves, we paid for 80 years or something like this. To do it in 10 to 25 is... Oh, it's insanity. But it's worth mentioning purely for the fact that this guy is a judge on the International Court of Justice. These are these globalist institutions that lefties insist that we have to be part of to keep human rights. And these are the sort of people who's in them. It's mad.
It's...
We should pay no regard to judges like this. And I don't really care for their institutions either. I know this is noise. I know it doesn't matter. But to those who don't know this already, these are the sort of people who run the international institutions. International Court of Justice judge. They're just activists. They just want to destroy the West. They don't care about law. They don't care about doing what's right, otherwise they'd seek reparations from the West Africans who sold their brothers to the Europeans in the first place. Or the Muslims who brought the East Africans. Or what about the Barbary slave trade, when North African Muslims would come and raid European shores and take our people as slaves? Where are our reparations? Apparently we don't deserve them. They're not even mentioned at all. So yeah, I mean the rest of this article is just nonsense, but That's the point. These are the sort of people making these claims. Pure activist scum. Anyway, let's talk about the more recent stuff. So, King Charles and the £200 billion slavery reparations bill looming over the Commonwealth Summit. And this was created by Nadine White, who is a race correspondent. Fuck's sake.
Fucking hell.
She's joined The Independent in 2021 as a race correspondent, the only such title at a UK news outlet. It's not a race correspondent. Usually you have like a France correspondent or an American correspondent. Fucking
race correspondent.
So yeah, this is all just going on about King Charles and Keir Starmer having renewed calls to pay for more reparations. It's not going to come to anything, frankly. It's not. But then again, you would have thought for the Chagos Islands that wouldn't come to anything. The most illegitimate claim ever, and yet the British government caved in. I'd argue because Lammy is a traitor. Earlier this month, Barbados' Prime Minister met with King Charles at Buckingham Palace in London, where she said they discussed the matter of reparations, and where she suggested a far higher figure. Oh my god. I mean, as a Brit, even the left-wing people in this country wouldn't ever dare to suggest like looting the king's pocket and saying that he's actually not paying enough. It's a huge disgrace. During a recent speech at a United Nations event, Mia Mottley raised the topic of reparations and said, "The numbers have been looked at and studied by many persons, and the figures suggest a minimum of $5 trillion, or 4.9 to be precise." The whole idea with reparations, because obviously there's been reparations for various things throughout history, but reparations they're a part of tort law in this country, and it's generally seen as a way to return someone to the state they were before the bad thing happened to them. But there's a meme of black Americans saying that they want to put things back to how they were before slavery, or as though slavery never happened, and they just get sent back to a mud hut in Africa. I mean, the reality is these people are so much better off than Africans in Africa, and they are so much better off to have been under European colonial rule. I mean, just compare like GDP per capita and life expectancy in the institutions, like the police, the order, like everything. They are in so many ways better off to have been, in our case, British colonies, than if they had just stayed as West African, like nothings.
Yeah.
Like, among those who have apologised and have agreed to offer versions of redress and pay the reparations include the Church of England, the Green King pub chain, the University of Glasgow, and the NHS Lothian Trust. The Church of England in the 19th century was one of the foremost fighters for abolition. If it wasn't for the Church of England, abolition would not have happened likely for at least another few decades. They were such an abolitionist force. The fact that they're apologising now is insane. They weren't ever involved in procuring slaves and trading slaves. They've kind of only ever been against the practice. Like, I'm presuming maybe
King
it was
have
set
to
up.
do with slavery?
I know. I presume back in the day they were set up by someone who owned slaves or something. But I don't know when Green King was founded, but the NHS was founded after World War II by people who'd never owned slaves, because it was obviously too far, like, in the past. So it's like a pub chain and the NHS, but these people never had involvement in the slave trade or owning slaves at all.
Hang on a minute. So should the North of America repay Texas, all those southern states that had slaves, because they took their slaves off them? So that's profit that those Southern American states lost. So should
that does bring up a point. I mean, when Britain abolished slavery in the empire in 1834, it did so by paying, I'll have to find the figure, but I think it was like £20 billion or some very high figure to slave owners so that they would stop owning slaves. And the left see this as like, oh my God, you're paying slave owners. How morally disgusting is that? But really, it's buying the freedom of the slaves. So we peacefully used the treasury, used the power of the British state to buy the freedom of the slaves. But we're told that that's not enough because we didn't pay the slaves.
Exactly. Should we have just rolled in and just sent men to death? Ridiculous.
They owned the slaves legally. Of course, it's a reprehensible moral crime, but by the letter of the law of the time, it was perfectly legal business venture. And then this disgraceful effort to deny the history of Britain ending slavery. Billions of pounds, thousands of lives, and a 150-year-long effort to stamp out slavery. And we're told that it wasn't really because of us. Absolute bloody disgrace. So Britain helped to end slavery, historians argue. So why pay reparations? And so what does
argue?
So what
it's not an argument, it's a fact.
Well, yes, of course.
It's not an argument. We fucking well did.
It's just such a poor attempt to delegitimise such an effort to stamp it out. Our lovely race correspondent says, slavery did not end purely because of English benevolence, but largely because enslaved African people resisted through revolts and the practice was becoming untenable. This is just fantasy. Complete lie.
Utter nonsense.
There were some revolts in the British Empire with slaves, but there weren't many, and we definitely could have held on if that was the will. And I mean, America held on for decades longer. Brazil held on for at least half a century longer. Saudi Arabia held on for more than a century longer. Like, the idea that slaves freed themselves by putting pressure on the government, it's just a fantasy. It's we was kangs. That's all this is.
Yeah, it's not like the slaves went out for a day with placards, is it?
It completely delegitimizes people like Wilberforce and Dr. Livingstone. There was a huge effort, huge expense. We paid 2% of our national GDP around this time to patrol West Africa to stop slave ships. Thousands of lives lost. Massive diplomatic effort to abolish it. Gunboat diplomacy used to abolish slavery. And this completely tries to delegitimize it by saying, no, it was actually the blacks who resisted through revolts. Like, they think the whole world is Haiti. Haiti's like the one notable case. And look at how much of a shithole Haiti is, by the way. But that's the one notable case of a successful slave revolt. It was not like that for anywhere else, really. It's a blatant grift. And we'd be complete fools to buy into it.
And the saying of historians argue. They don't argue, it's a fact. They don't argue, it's a fact. It fucking happened.
Yeah. At the very least, Starmer's not budging. No government's budging. No government would ever commit to wiping itself out in the next election.
And wiping
it is
its
just
economy.
Noise, but the people who are backing this, the influence they have, even like a man like David Lammy, who did back this and now he's a foreign secretary, it's all just a farce.
He's been very, very quiet.
I mean, this is another important thing to touch on. David Lammy, our foreign secretary, back when Labour was in opposition and he was little more than just a race grifter, said, "I'm afraid, as Caribbean people, we are not going to forget our history. We do not just want to hear an apology, we want reparations." This man is supposed to be representing Britain on the diplomatic stage. And yet he says that he is a Caribbean person. He, along with other Caribbean people, wants reparations. Clearly, this man does not consider himself to be British. He considers himself to be foreign to Britain. And yet he is representing Britain. He is the man charged to negotiate deals with foreign governments in Britain's interest. Yet he wants reparations from us to his people. Our people to his people. It's mad. It's mad. It's completely mad. I mean, people have spoken about suing Keir Starmer for treason because of what he said about preferring Davos to Westminster. But we've an even stronger case here. David Lammy does not consider himself British. He wants to pick the pockets of the British for his people. How? I know there is a larger debate about whether foreign nationals, even those with dual citizenship, should ever be in government. But I think there's a strong case to make that, especially at these top positions of Prime Minister, Home Secretary, or in this case, Foreign Secretary, no, you should have someone undyingly loyal to the crown, and anyone short of that is treasonous. That's what we have. It's treason. And the other mistake that's constantly being made is showing signs of weakness. I mean, it's one thing to say that slavery was awful, and it was. But we should really be patting ourselves on the back for ending the slavery. I mean, when you have King Charles III describing his profound sorrow, or Prince William describing it as abhorrent, that's only half the picture. And the other half of the story is not being told, and it absolutely must be. But yeah, we should never apologise for this, because an apology is tacitly an admission of guilt. Anyway, that's all. Like I said, I will be making a proper video about the British crusade against slavery, and that will go into far more detail about Britain's role in ending the practice, and go into far more detail about how it happened around the world. But yeah, you can consider this a little preview of that, I suppose. Anyway, do let me know what you think in the comments about reparations, about slavery, about Britain's history of it. Ultimately, it is just noise and we probably shouldn't be paying any attention to it. But nonetheless, it's still controversial and many people like to express opinions, so do please express yours. Other than that, like, subscribe, and God save the King.